Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts with an S. My guest for this show is Rajesh Sampath, PhD, Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Justice, Rights, and Social Change, Associate Director and Core Faculty of the MA Program in Sustainable International Development at Brandeis University. We met at the recent Peace and Social Justice Studies Conference. I liked what you had to say, so I'm glad you're able to make it here. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Rob. Thank you so much.
So I'm not sure where to begin, really. You talked, though, at the conference about how there's a new majority, which is really an aggregate of minorities, and that for some demographics, it's already happening. For overall, it could take some years yet. Talk about some of those stats. Tell us about that.
Well, the U.S. Census is about to revise itself in 2020. I can't speculate on what the future format can look like. That's forthcoming. But we have a history in this country where certain ethnic minorities start to grow at a faster rate than others, and that forces an adjustment on the census. And my kind of work is to really kind of critically examine the assumptions that doesn't always come out in public conversations as to how these shifts take place in terms of the U.S.'s racial classification system. But in terms of the basic stats, since you asked about that, 0 to 18, what are called Generation Z, post-millennial, births since 2000. The first freshmen now entering into higher education, they were born in 2000, if they're 18 years old now. That 0 to 18 is now below 50% non-Latino, quote-unquote Hispanic. Hispanic meaning from Latin America, South America, Spanish-speaking heritage. The preferable term, if you ask the younger generation, is Latinx. It's gender inclusive, Latino, Latina. So the Latino, Latina, Latinx population, if you look at the people that do not descend from Latin America, South America, so if you're considered Caucasian or white, you have two parents of European ancestry, that group, white European ancestry, is now below 50%. That means that there are other groups that comprise our major minority groups that are holding steady. The African American may increase by a percentage or two, and we'll get into structural issues about racism and oppression and how that affects growth rates. But for the basic stats, Latino, quote-unquote Hispanic, is still growing, roughly could be up to 16-17% of the country. Asian Americans, Southeast Asians, besides the two dominant countries that send us a lot of students on visas, the Chinese and the Indian subcontinents, really, they're more than countries, but those are the two big countries that comprise the Asian American identity, but we're seeing faster rates with Southeast Asian, Filipino, Vietnamese, et cetera. So when you take into account those groups and even multiracial, so biracial, multiracial, parents of two different racial groups, if you look back in 1960, the multiracial percentage would have been about 1%. The anti-miscegenation law, so it had to be overturned. That's one of the fastest growing groups, or up to about 10% and growing rapidly. That's just the trans humanist Generation Z that's emerging. But millennials, 18 to 34, roughly speaking, current undergrads, graduates, people entering the labor markets, you can see the push now for people changing the face of the Democratic Party. And it's not just a question of left, progressive, moderate, center. New faces, new people, new minorities are emerging to become representatives. Millennials are slightly above in terms of white European, but not much. So now you have 0 to 36, someone like myself, Gen X, births from roughly the early 60s to the late 70s, early 80s, late 30s to early 50s. Obviously less diverse. It's really those baby boomers, and I mean not just 55 and over, but literally the 60, 65, 70, 80. That is predominantly white. And so now we have really two societies, and the progression and the diversification has taken place a lot faster than we thought.
When I went to high school, there were 1,300 people in my graduating class.
Mm-hmm.
there was one person of color. That was a city school too. It's amazing.
There you go. There
Yeah.
you go.
Yeah. So is it 51% non-European, non-white?
So European, non-Latino, non-Hispanic, white is that for 0 to 18 or 18 to 36 or
Yeah, the 0 to 18.
that group is now below 50%, and
Was it just below? Is it like 51% now for the
it's
49% or
it's roughly
49.5?
49ish. Yeah, it's not down to
49.
30 or 20%. So it's roughly still half the population for that age bracket.
What's the projections on where it'll be in 10 years for
Well, I mean,
next
we
generation?
can speculate that if we think about faster growing groups, the Asian population and also multiracial, if we count them as not two parents of white European descent, and you take in the steady rates for African American, Latinx, Hispanic, you know, it's really hard to speculate. It's a question of what happens between as these young people start to marry and partner and reproduce or adopt. You know, there's just the diversification, I think, is going to accelerate. So it's really,
I think it sounds like the fastest growing group is multiracial.
it's for that age bracket. Yeah, I mean that's what we're seeing. So, and if you think about geographically, it's not really just, you think of the immigration from Latin America, for example, coming in through the South and moving towards the coast. It's really across the country now, and you
Now,
see
why do you care about that? Why do you talk about that? I think it has to do with your work with students, right?
Well, we're talking about, the changing demography that's going to impact higher education. I mean, higher education was built around a supply of PhDs from the 60s onwards who are now settled faculty who are predominantly white and predominantly male. And unlike the European system that may have mandatory retirement, we don't have that in our system. We have tenure. And as people feel productive and want to contribute to the community, they have important functions to play across the university. That's how we do things. Now, having said that, you do have this older generation of faculty who, like I said, are predominantly white and male, who are now, facing this increasingly diverse. And as you go younger, people are opening up with very complex pluralistic identities. For example, transgender students could undergo the transformation much earlier because maybe the social norms are more flexible, where they feel more comfortable, and they don't want to use the pronouns she or he. They identify as they. That's non-binary. Is it, the signification is about freedom and self-determination. And it's not that people wantonly want to discriminate. The conservatives in our political system and some of our state legislatures, and certainly the current administration and the national platform for most Republicans, may not be so readily accepting of transforming these laws. As a matter of fact, with the new appointment to the Supreme Court, people are really concerned about whatever progress was made for the LGBTQ community, we could start to see a regress. So there's some real concerns here about the structure of our political economy and how is it going to manage this complexity and diversity. So what I'm trying to get at is that every year it appears to me, and I've been in my position for 7 years now, this is at the start of my academic career as a faculty member. So if I'm looking at the next 20 or 30 years, knock on wood, every year I see more nuance and complexity as to the way group identities form, individual identities assert themselves, and ways to communicate in the classroom, degrees of sensitivity. Obviously, people believe in free speech. Our whole Enlightenment and democratic tradition is based on the free expression and exchange of ideas. People should be able to use reason and facts to dispute each other, disagree fundamentally with fundamental beliefs. Inversely, though, with an increasingly diverse population, you have greater degrees of sensitivity. People do feel harm or can take offense based on how people communicate and address each other. So that's what, just based on my function here in the university, I've seen this increase in complexity.
So there are two things. One of the topics that came up a lot at the Peace and Justice Studies Conference 2 weekends ago was intersectionality,
mm-hmm.
and also the idea that some people who have different cultural histories don't want to go into a melting pot.
Yeah, I think if we just partition those two pieces, we can talk about multiculturalism, its history, what does it mean today? How's that different from pluralism? And then this term intersectionality, maybe we can give a general definition of that. It's an academic term for most people, but it's mainstreaming.
Yeah, I
But
keep on hearing it and keep encountering it. And so what can you talk a little, let's start out talking a little bit about intersectionality and what it means to the average person and as an academic concept.
sure, we can. And, I have to highlight the tradition of something called critical race theory, which really grew out of America's law schools in the 80s. The founding figure, sort of forebearer for this, was Derek Bell, who is seminal textbook Race, Racism, the American Law in the 70s, really kind of pioneered a lot of the ideas that would inform this notion of both critical race theory eventually and then intersectionality. Intersectionality.
But wait, what is critical race theory?
We'll talk about that
Okay,
and the relationship to intersection. But the simple definition of intersectionality is, let's say you identify as a minority in at least two categories, minimum. So let's say, for example, you're Black and female. So, you face, in terms of general patriarchy and gender bias and gender discrimination, gender-based violence and oppression as a woman, you face that structure, which cuts across all racial groups. But then there's racism because you're also a person of color, in this case, African American. So you're at the intersection of two colliding systems of oppression. And if you take the lens of just one to view the other, you're going to miss out on the intersectionality. There's a very famous case where in the 40s, I believe, African-American women were protesting for their labor rights. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the argument was they're facing essentially a double discrimination. And the court back then, without having this conception of intersectionality, said, well, I see African-American men in the assemblies and the plants, so there's no discrimination there on the basis of race. And I see white female secretaries in the office helping the managers and the heads of the factories and the plants. So where's the discrimination? So it's just taken a while for this movement called critical race theory, which grew out of the law school, saying, look, there's just got to be a way to move beyond two things. That if you isolate an individual action, let's say a single individual, and can prove their intent to discriminate, then the law can try to provide some kind of remedy. But let's say it's not about agency or intentionality of the actor discriminating against another. It's about structural forces that invisibilize the way intersectionally complex people experience their oppression, and there's no real way to articulate the nature of that. And so for the last 30 years, mostly in the law schools, now educational schools, I'm in a social policy school, and quite frankly, undergrads are getting exposed to this tradition.
So structural discrimination, talk about that.
Well, if we move beyond critical race theory, we think about intersectionality. And by the way, intersectionality can get...
Wait, I'm still not clear about critical race theory. Where does that fit in?
I'll bring that back, but to just clarify once again, intersectionality, how complex that can get. Imagine if you're a queer person of color who is also a religious minority in your own community, and perhaps whose immigration status is under attack. Ooh. Maybe you're a migrant or you're a refugee. So you can imagine
a quadruple whammy.
That's the quadruple. It can get more complicated. But think about that, the earlier conversation we had about diversity. So critical race theory really tries to apply 20th century tools from what's called critical theory. And critical theory is a tradition that grew out of Europe, quite frankly, by a number of German Jewish immigrants who left during the Nazi period and formed this school of critical race theory here in the United States, but of course also within Germany. Many returned after the war. And critical race theory tries to amalgamate several major intellectual figures in our Western canon. This is long before the birth of critical race theory. It's obviously in a predominantly white European canon, but Marx's critique, not so much his critique of capitalism, although it is that, it's his critique of the nature of alienation in the modern period. How does labor get expropriated? Is there a distortion in our fundamental human essence because the system of capitalism is not, and living in a market society is not how human beings are supposed to live? To Freudian psychoanalysis that said, let's take the unconscious seriously. We spent 1/3 of our lives asleep. That doesn't mean we're useless or our dreams are useless, but the structure of the unconscious can go beyond the individual subjectivity and permeate cultures. To the critique of ideology and the rationality of our institutions. that modern Western institutions that operate by some kind of bureaucratic rationality, Max Weber, sociologists, call that into question. So there are a number of great critics. Nietzsche, the German philosopher, critiqued the heritage of Christian norms in terms of its institutionalization. So all these different intellectual critiques of the modern age, to imagine a horizon beyond that, was sort of the foundations that then informed, at least in the American context, and where you see racial minorities rising in other Western societies, Western European, for example. When you take that framework, but you look at it from a lens of a person of color, you can start to explore that structural determination, structural violence, interhistorical trauma generations that pass down a type of trauma based on the oppression they faced in the context of Native Americans, for example, African Americans in slavery, all the way up to Black Lives Matter, in a post-civil rights era, that we need a broader lens to examine the nature of two things. White privilege. Again, we're not talking about individual actors. We're not talking about the isolated KKK and the white nationalists who still rear their ugly heads, like Charlottesville, or permeate the discourse of white nationalism that can inform the ideas of someone like Steve Bannon, as much as he might want to disassociate himself with that, or if even in Trump's futile attempt to even think through these issues, to try and disassociate himself from this. There's still this pervasive fear of the right wing, the alt-right, the neo-fascism, white nationalism, white ethnocentrism. That's still there, but it can happen here. There you go. It's happening here. It's happening throughout Europe. It's happening in many parts of the world. But if you talk about the right wing, we can get into that. But bringing it back to specifically moving away from this heritage of the white terrorism of Jim Crow and the KKK, or those that believe in biological superiority because of their race, which hasn't gone away. It's still here. It's frightening. And we need to have a response, a collective response to that.
It's re-emerged in a frightening way.
It's transmutating. It's getting more complicated. It tries to be subtle. It tries to pretend it's a peaceful movement, as if peaceful ethno-cleansing could, what does that even mean? It's an oxymoron. But to move beyond that, to get into critical race theory, you're looking at, again, intersectionality is important, but you're looking at those features where there may not be any real intention to discriminate, but there are these mechanisms where de facto resegregation, for example, takes place in schools or in communities where people purchase homes.
You're still losing me, though. I still don't have a clear understanding of what critical race theory is. So,
critical race theory is the attempt to deconstruct social systems that perpetuate unconscious, unintended white privilege and continue to marginalize certain portions of our population who are identified as racial minorities. So it's a new way of theoretical critique and analysis to look at the nature of white privilege. How does it reproduce itself subtly in our in our media?
I call the show the Bottom Up Show, and I think one dimension of bottom up is systems theory. I think that the systems approach to understanding things replaced the Cartesian Newtonian approach because they didn't work to study subatomic particle physics or complex ecological systems. And I think what you're talking about with critical race theory is taking a systemic approach to looking at these kind of factors. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, sociology has its own tradition within systems theory. It also grew out of cybernetics. It was applied to, it's a field by itself, as in the natural sciences when I think about complexity theory, chaos theory, quantum improbabilities, stochastic improbabilities. That's all important. I mean, those social theoretical innovations, but also the innovations in the natural sciences showing us that Newtonian Cartesian model, as you said, is sort of suspect. There's a more complex reality out there. It's multidimensional. It's not binary.
It seems to me that critical race theory takes that kind of a model's approach to understanding culture.
I think it stems from the fact that individuals, especially those intersectional individuals, the resources, linguistic, conceptual resources we have in our cultures and our societies in the West are just not adequate. They're binary in their nature. So for example, transgender obviously transcends binary, he or she, it's they. Or if you're a person that's identified with two variables of minority status, it's that intersectionality that's hard to grasp when you think of things in either simple Euclidean linear, frameworks. You have to, like you said, accept complexity in the way identities are being formed. The problem is that most of our systems of thinking at the level of policy and laws and even political discourse, or how the media frames the discussions is still very binary. It's not even a question of politicization. Is it is it Fox News talking from a more conservative, sometimes libertarian perspective, or is it CNN, which may be more democratic leaning? In the mainstream in general, our society is built on this binary notion.
Would it also, I mean, I tend to use the idea of linear rather than binary as compared to systemic. Does that make sense as well?
Well, I mean, if you look at the philosophy of history, for example, I mean, modernity and modern progress, there's so many philosophers of history from the 19th century all the way to the 1960s that really, before we get into the postmodern critique of that, what does that mean in terms of linear temporality or circle temporality, linearity? But let's just take a step back and see what the achievements of the modern period were. Obviously, in an 18th century Western Europe, where only white men were the citizens, and of course the founding figures of this country, when other women were considered, in terms of a class, as property, as were African-American slaves during the slave trade to the United States and Brazil. So it was a very exclusive group of people that defined this notion of citizenship. But what were they doing in the Enlightenment? They were literally reoccupying, to quote the philosopher Hans Blumenberg, a very famous German philosopher from the 60s, that something weird about the modern age is that it reoccupies all those massive questions in the medieval Christian cosmology, posing these questions about the origins of the universe or the nature of the soul. But in that time, in that cosmology, it was a Christian metaphysical response. There were answers, ready-made answers, that could provide solutions to those deep questions. And in his model, instead of thinking about how we secularized that and got rid of the religion, and now we have this modern notion of progress, he thinks it's a little bit more nuanced. What modernity has to constantly do is that it inherits and reoccupies those questions, but it's constantly vacating and using criticism to destroy, superstition and myth and anything that doesn't fall into rationality or scientific proof. But it's a game that's constantly playing, but in that it grows, its power grows. It's constantly asserting its legitimacy. And that's what makes it very exciting. And that's just the modern period. Postmodernism comes along in the 60s and 70s through a number of French critics, Anglo-American, et cetera. And their five main thematic areas of critique are whether you have this Blumenbergian notion of reoccupying and self-asserting and the mystery and the openness of, the fact that we don't have ready-made answers. Human beings have to determine themselves. You still have this underlying conception of modernity as this notion of linear progress. That's what positivism is. We went through these stages in myth to then metaphysics and then to now the last stage of science. After the collapse of the Cold War, 1989, one of the famous texts of the period, Francis Fukuyama, proclaimed universally that this is the end of history. This is the end state is capitalism, free markets, democracy, individual rights, et cetera, et cetera. There's no more competing polar ideology like communism. So modernity has this feature of either continuing onwards in this indefinite progress, or we've ended at this steady state. Postmodernity comes along and questions both of those. It also questions the centrality of the subject, that this thing called the human being endowed with these rights, that's really an historical fiction that was constructed in the 19th century. We have no idea. There's a discontinuity in history. We can't go back to the other side and see how, let's say, in the 15 and 1600s, people dealt with the experience of madness, as Michel Foucault explored in his early works. So everything that we do in the late 19th and early 20th century about psychiatry and psychology and policy, those are arbitrary historical creations that just sort of came about and could eventually disappear, and something else could appear. So in other words, it believes in a discontinuous model of history.
All right, so a question. I want to get a clear idea of reoccupation. What does that mean?
So in the Blumenbergian model, and by the way, the text is 1963, the English translation is the legitimacy of the modern age, Umbesetzung, reoccupying is the English term, but, repositioning, resettling in, reoccupying. He was trying to get at this notion that in the modern period, what we end up doing is that we go back and try to take over those questions that were handed down to us, but we also vacate or destroy or move aside the answer positions that you would have as a middle person in the Middle Ages who would have a ready-made answer to some complex metaphysical or cosmological position. You don't
Sounds quite radical.
It's a radical thesis, but if you take it, look at someone like Foucault and in terms of his archaeology.
It sounds like the opposite of conservatism.
Well, there are subtle debates about where, if you want to defend modernity and rationality and the Enlightenment Project, and perpetual critique, and still believe in our democratic institutions, it could either sound liberal or conservative. It's certainly not something radical like a postmodern skepticism of the modern age. The modern age hasn't delivered on progress, that there is no equality, that certainly in Western societies, racial minorities, women, immigrants, religious minorities suffer persecution and exclusion and marginality. So whatever the modern age promised, it promised only one group. So, but someone like a Foucault, take another approach to this nonlinearity. He asked some really, intriguing questions about almost deconstructing, vacating, as a Blumenberg term, but in his term, deconstructing and sort of like unsettling our natural understanding of things like sexuality. And think about this, the politics of sexuality.
I like it. I like the idea of questioning everything, challenging everything. I think I even wrote an op-ed about it once, and that we should teach children to do that as well.
That's deconstruction. It's an ethics. So my mentor people pressed him like, well, if you keep on deconstructing everything, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to build anything. You're not going to get people to believe in anything. No, the ethics is that constant sort of like imagination to unsettle things and then open up the fissures where new ways of thinking and new groups can be invited into the conversation.
That's the way systems and organic life works. Everything is done that way.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is fun. Professor of philosophy of justice, rights, and social change. You're pulling those pieces together. I like it.
Trying. I don't know how to ask my students and colleagues how successful I am, but it seems to be working now.
So to get back to my initial question about how among the younger generation, they have become through an aggregate of minorities, a majority.
Right.
What happens when a majority becomes a minority and when a minority becomes a majority?
Well, you said an aggregate of minorities. So think about that diversity. There's not just white and non-white. And regards to what happens with the US Census, for example, there are Asian American groups that want to disaggregate. They don't like the term Asian or Asian American. Is it a construction of race? Is it a geography? Is it white or black? Does the black-white binary, which dominates racial thinking in the United States, is that even appropriate to talk about other racialized groups, Latino, Hispanic, Asian? So do other groups want to disaggregate Latinx, Hispanic into, let's say, Mexican American or Cuban American or Guatemalan American, et cetera? Do South Asians and Asians want to disaggregate themselves, Pakistani, Indian, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Filipino, Chinese, Korean, et cetera, as opposed to having these large blocks? What is certain is that it's virtually impossible to disaggregate whiteness because people just don't know their ancestry. You can do that DNA, ancestry.com, but given the waves of immigration from Europe from the 19th century to the present, most people couldn't trace what percentage is Scottish versus Irish versus German versus this or that, et cetera, et cetera. But it would be kind of disconcerting if whiteness remained disaggregated and everybody else did. So when you talk about an aggregate of minorities who also don't share same values and principles about liberation and social change.
So this gets back to my question that I asked you earlier about people opposing the idea of the melting pot.
Yeah, there are a couple of things. Does multiculturalism just blend everything together? Is it the preservation of group identity? Do those group identities sometimes conflict with each other? Let me give you an example. An Asian American coalition is putting forward a class action suit against Harvard, and the DOJ has picked it up. And their claim is that Asian Americans, the two biggest groups predominantly being Indian American and Chinese, have been discriminated against in the admissions policy because on average, for them to have any fighting chance to get into Harvard, they have to score up to 200 points more than white candidates. Harvard, of course, has the power and the financial muscle to recruit and diversify. It's a private institution. If it wants to have a certain number of African American or Latinx students, it can do that. But the argument by this Asian American coalition is that if it were just purely meritocratic, blind, and no affirmative action, and you looked at the raw metrics of GPA and SAT, instead of the calculus that Harvard uses to find the well-rounded, superhuman kid that they recruit to come to Harvard, they shouldn't be at 16 to 18%, which they have been traditionally. I think they're up now to the low 20s. But like, say, a place like Caltech, where it's purely meritocratic and blind, They should be, just based on pure competition, 30 to 40%. So that's one minority group.
I mean, well,
that,
the other side
would,
of it is meritocracy is a fraud anyway.
Exactly. It's one group on the philosophy of meritocracy capturing all this political and economic power. You come out of these institutions, you become the future leaders of society. What about those African Americans? What about the Latinx? What about the poor whites who or could be first generation college attending, but should have a chance to compete for Ivy League spots? Another intersectional question. Think about it. Ashkenazi Jews are men, cisgender, birth, so we'll just go with this heteronormative cisgender binary white Ashkenazi men of European descent who are Jewish, multi-generational, so we're not talking conversion here. If they are automatically conflated with whiteness and diversity is rising, what's going to happen to that group who has their own one of the longest trajectories of suffering in human history, from Egypt to 1945 with the Holocaust? So, and here they're facing incredible pressure within Western European countries, rising anti-Semitism in this country, not just Charlottesville, but you think about potentiality, that fragility and that insecurity that continues as that people tries to persevere and maintain their identity. But does that group get conflated with whiteness when everybody else is deconstructing this concept of whiteness? So there's so much complexity in this idea of race, and it has a long history in the United States. It's very complicated. It's very hard for people to predict what could be the new modality of racism. Eduardo Bonilla Silva is an American sociologist, Afro-Caribbean, great book, Racism Without Racists. And the paradigm is that African-American slavery, Jim Crow segregation, separate but equal, white mobs terrorizing Black people who moved out of the line, so to speak, in terms of that separation, terrorizing them, acting with impunity. There's no state protection, to the battles of desegregation, Brown v. Board, and then the civil rights, people just fighting for basic political and civil rights to destroy that segregation. But then the post-civil rights, where this resegregation takes place, all the way up to now, Black Lives Matter, which is basically saying political and civil rights, we're now talking about the dignity of life, just the right to live. So if you think about that trajectory, the modalities of, and time is not going to help you. It's not this linear progress. Nobody wants to go back to African-American slavery, but nobody wants to get shot either, with no justice, no concern by society about the deterioration of communities because of our neoliberal policies, as Cornel West has pointed out. So point being is that if civil rights was about, judging by the content of my character, not the color of my skin, as Martin Luther King has said, Dr. Martin Luther King has said, we're talking about the possibility of what people call, like Bonilla Silva, a post-racial racism, a color blindness in American culture. It's not about biological superiority, inferiority, like the Nazis and the neo-Nazis and the KKK. It's about, most white Americans who are liberal probably believe in some kind of racial progress. They don't have those, nefarious concepts of racial superiority.
Oh, wait a second. We need to do a show ID, so we'll pick up on this, on post-racial racism after the show ID.
Sure.
So we're going to pause. So on the radio, I can just pick up the spot in editing the sound.
Okay. So you might want to just repost the question.
I know. And my guest for this show is Rajesh Sampath, PhD, Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Justice, Rights, and Social Change, who I met at the recent Peace and Justice Studies Conference. So you were talking about post-racial racism. What's that?
So, or colorblind racism, or the new racism, or the racial structure. These are all Bonilla Silva's terms, in quotes. Again, the book is Racism Without Racists. A lot of optimism in 2008, the first African-American president, quite frankly, the first half multiracial president. He's half white. But needless to say, the first person of color. I mean, it's been white and male, as you know, as have been most of our justices and most of our senators, et cetera, et cetera. So the optimism that when he speaks about this optimism, there's optimism like, oh, wow, look at this. This is an amazing moment. And it's possible that racism is going to be a thing of the past. To what he calls the peso optimist will say, well, as a liberal, I do believe that we should fight for racial progress, but I'm not going to put myself on the line. And meanwhile, de facto segregation is taking place again in the schools or in communities, or there's gerrymandering in states. So there's also something called symbolic racism, where you want to subtly and subliminally talk about the unconscious, channel, your views about why there isn't progress for some communities, let's say African American, Latinx. They're to blame for poverty or their criminalization, the school to prison pipelines Michelle Alexander speaks about, the new Jim Crow. So there's all these other variations. And he says, look, I need to critically examine all these. I don't want to go back to a pre-critical race theory phase where you just talk about the intentionality of certain actors. But I want to look at this new structure. He calls it the racial structure. It's the totality of relations that occur in our society for reasons that we're still trying to examine that reproduce this white privilege and diminish the possibility of progress. Colorblind racism is, in a sense, he's not attacking the conservatives or the far right, whether they say they're, don't have racist views. People Trump supporters defend the fact that he's not a racist. For a lot of people, it's bona fide racism. It's not on this, it's not implicit. It's on the surface. I mean, they just listen to what he has to say. So, but what
it's cultivated and harvested racism.
Right, and then repackaging, presenting itself in a way that doesn't appear to be racist, and to speak to this base that he has. But the colorblind racism, to use that phrase, if you just think about perhaps the base of white liberalism, which gets back into this issue of diversity in institutions. Now people are challenging students of color, for example, when they talk about white supremacy, they're not talking about the KKK invading the campus. They're talking about just mainstream institutions in which privilege is reproduced. And there's something, as Robin DiAngelo's work shows, a phrase called white fragility, where there are all kinds of interesting mechanisms in place where even good-natured white liberals reach a certain threshold where they're not comfortable speaking about, you're looking back at a book in your...
Yeah, I'm looking to see if I can find it. My Angry White Men book. I can't, but it's not right behind me.
Well, the book is coming out, but the article that got a lot of critical acclaim and discussion in higher education, especially among...
I already interviewed the guy who wrote the book, Angry White Men.
That's different. So I was talking about this concept of white fragility with Robin DiAngelo. But so white people have this sort of fragility, which means there's a certain discomfort that takes place and blindness that kicks in, where they can't see the effects. It may not be intentional discrimination, but cannot see the effects that institutions have on people of color who express a great degree of trauma just getting through school.
Now, you use a term, it's racism sublimated into institutional level.
Yeah. Well, if I were to speak about...
Sounds like a similar thing you're talking about now.
Well, my work, having come out of the philosophy of history, we talked a lot about that, modernity and post-modernity, and those white male European roots. Talking about American diversity and complexity, you can talk about Western Europe as well. We can speak about other contexts, minorities and other global contexts throughout the world, the global South and the non-West. But looking at the American case, because we have this unique possibility of the non-Latino white European ancestry group becoming a minority. And if you think about white men in particular, let's say if they go down to the population for that group goes down to 40%, male and female, half of that roughly male. If that pace continues, in which white men, cisgender, heteronormative, but quite frankly, upper middle class, wealthy, prominent white gay men who are assuming positions of power, but we're focusing on the heteronormative majority, white men, 20% occupying Fortune 500 CEOs, still most of the professorships, all the Supreme Court justices, the last two nominees, all these other judicial appointments, heads of titans of industries, heads of media. If you look at a small group capturing all the political economic power, it's not far off to say that may not be South African apartheid, constitutionally defended political economic oppression. But statistically speaking, just by the capture of the wealth and the power, there's some eerie resemblances going on here.
It's not eerie. It's just screamingly obvious. I mean, and it's the way history has been for hundreds of years.
And what we haven't seen since colonization, this is the philosopher of history hat that I wear, from 1500 to the present, when those first conquistadors left Southern Europe, and then the other empires were built, Dutch, French, British, going around the world, it's in that construction of something that's non-white that is responsible for the racialization and eventually sublimation of that type of racialized thinking into the institutions and practices that keep the white privilege intact. But just racializing the other meant that whiteness gets to be invisible. It's the a priori or condition of possibility to view the other as such. It's Du Bois' plight in our chapter 1 of The Souls of Black Folk on our spiritual strivings, when he says, it's that babies and Europeans are the ones that don't see themselves in terms of race, which is true. He's being ironic. But here he is, not knowing he's black. He's a kid. He's playing in the Northeast. It's a beautiful scene. And the kids are playing, and suddenly they're playing some game where I think they're taking some cards, and they're supposed to exchange that with another. A new girl shows up. She comes up to him, and she doesn't want to take his card. It's the first moment of the dawning where you're made to think that you're different. The veil goes up. You can no longer see the world with that innocence. You're constantly kind of penetrating and seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, who's making you think that you are something than what you yourself can see about yourself. You have two consciousnesses, the double consciousness. They can never merge. And that's the permanent state that people of color find themselves in.
And that's the state that our culture is in.
We'll get to that macro extrapolation, but if we think about just this individual experience, now imagine this. So whiteness is the condition to do that to everybody else that's not white and keep it in this system. Whether it's a classificatory system, or it's the system of our political economy, or the way we organize our cultural images. To racialize something requires one thing, that you're the majority. But now that majority is disappearing. What's apocalyptic, almost cataclysmic, what I mean by the epochal shift from colonization to the present, is that we've never racialized whiteness as a minoritized object, just like it's done to others internally within the West and through colonization imperialism.
Well, that's where I asked the question, what happens when a majority becomes a minority?
Du Bois talks about that from the Black experience. What's going to happen to that whiteness? How are we going to achieve our goals? What are our goals? Egalitarianism, if we want to go with some of these Western European principles, equality, liberty, fraternity, the balance of equality and liberty, two different things. If we want everyone to be equal through rights and have laws to defend those rights and duties to uphold those rights, we want that fundamental equality, basic political and civil rights, of course, but perhaps economic rights, so right and fair distribution, the right for students not to be in debt, for example.
You're talking about a bunch of liberal values, really.
Liberal values, exactly. And then the other side of it is liberty. But somebody else's liberty could be the deprivation of another person's liberty. So, for example, bring it back to the student campus environment, some conservative kids who might be the minority, probably white and male, not necessarily, want to bring some very controversial speaker that is just going to be a provocateur and say things that will just get people going. Even the failed attempt of Richard Spencer, the white nationalist, to try to come onto campuses. If you think about that, that's a defense of free speech. Okay, you can bring anybody you want, even a Nazi, to a campus, and you can have a peaceful protest within the constitutional framework of what that could look like, a certain amount of distance. You do it peacefully. But that's the old kind of constitutional framework to think about it. As long as you're not inciting violence, that racist speaker is not literally asking to go kill people of color while they're speaking, or it's a racial hate crime where you can link the actual crime with the racial intent based on hatred. The old model is like, okay, well, that's free speech. What happens when that speaker's done? The trauma that can cause, what signals does that send? How do you account for the students of color who may have a certain view that even the very act or gesture in the name of defending free speech, which is a liberty, really grew out of this white male historical context? Or it could be about the Second Amendment. You can take any of those Bill of Rights, or did they grow out of this white constitutional framework designed primarily for men until women started to get their rights? And so one person's liberty in that regard is a deprivation of someone else's liberty, a negative liberty, meaning a liberty to be free from harm. I don't want to hear the N-word. I don't want to be called it. I've been called it in several phases of my life, as a young person to an adult. Each time it's damaging. So, how are we going to strike that?
You alarm me when you suggest that. I mean, I frankly, when I talk to conservatives who raise the issue of censorship of speakers in universities, I tend to lean towards the allowing people to speak. And I don't think that liberty from feeling hurt emotionally is something that's in our Constitution. I mean, I
Right.
think that if something pisses you off, then get out there and do something about it. If a
Right.
guy
Take it to
comes
the
and
streets.
says
Take it.
something that is offensive to you, then take a stand and vote and get out and knock on doors and do things. But you don't have the right to say he doesn't have the right to talk at all.
No, 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 no. You misunderstood me. I'm not advocating any kind of policy. No universities figure this out. Most people are erring on the side of free speech. Very
Good.
few campuses have speech codes. So I'm not taking a position here about censorship, what the constitutional bounds are, what the
You're
moral right
raising an
is.
issue of
What
the
I'm saying is
right
that
to be not having your feelings hurt.
this diversity and equality and liberty is the complex balance that we have to strike so everybody's interests are respected. And using that critical race theory framework, which is to understand the nature of oppression when it occurs, is going to require creative thinking
No, there's no question about
to
that.
strike an equilibrium based on sound policies. But no one, as far as I've spoken to, is going all the way over to the side of, oh, well, no one has a right to speak. And that's not actually happening. Most campuses still preserve that right.
That's a good
But
thing.
having said that, the critical race theorist, if I can alert you to a text from the early 90s, kind of ahead of its time, did try to take this very counterintuitive, progressive, revolutionary perspective on the First Amendment. It's called Words That Wound. And the authors are Crenshaw, Matsuda, and I'm forgetting others. I can give you the reference offline. But the title of the book is Words That Wound. Some of the founding figures of critical race theory took this revolutionary view on this issue of free speech. I'm just getting at the fact that we don't have the intellectual, conceptual resources to think and manage the emerging complexity and diversity until we start thinking in complex and diverse ways and maintain those liberal values that you just espoused, which is obviously if people should have the right to speak and let them speak, because you know what? That can galvanize, just like when Trump was elected, after all the crazy things he said, the first thing that happened after the inauguration were the women's marches. And there'll be more coming. We'll see what November is going to shake out to be.
Yes,
So
we will.
democracy becomes, enlivened and with its diversity.
So I want to move on a little bit because we got, maybe 14 minutes left, 13, 14 minutes left. You study theories of justice. Can you discuss conservative versus liberal theories of justice?
Some of my colleagues can better. I can just, I
No,
can
you're
surmise.
here.
Yeah. What I can surmise is that if I think of conservative ideals, and it's not just a question, we can bracket the Trump movement, we can talk about mainstream Republican and conservative values. But if it's neoliberalism, if it's a free market principle, if it's not just a defense of the Bill of Rights, but it's about those individual liberties and rights. You go into the market, you compete. We do live in capitalism, so unless you want to move to a Marxist or a communist framework, there's going to be class inequality. There's going to be differentiation in the classes and the amount of wealth that people accrue. And it's just the nature of the beast. And it's better that we at least compete in a capitalist market system than in tribal warfare where we're killing each other and fighting for resources. So sublimate those passions, as Montesquieu says, into the market. So there's something to be said about preserving some kind of national identity or making sure that we take care of our own growth internally, or we need to protect our borders and defend ourselves. There's nothing wrong in taking pride in our symbols. And so you wonder the African-American athletes who are protesting, as an act of free speech against a symbol for them, a symbol of oppression, and for a lot of people. Conservatives might take a different point of view that, okay, well, we're talking about the defense of basic freedoms and rights and the maximization of success that one has. Now, as Max Weber taught us, that also descends from a very particular ethic that's conducive for Protestantism, for capitalism, based on what he diagnosed from this Protestant ethic that grew in Northern Europe and New England here. And that was this notion of a calling, or that material success is some kind of sign of being saved or grace, that you have this particular
So
validation.
you're saying that modern capitalism is inspired by Protestant values?
It's not my theory. It's a very famous thesis by one of the founding figures that
By
launched
Weber.
sociology. Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about that theory, then we can contrast liberal.
Well, no, where I want to go with this is you wrote a piece for the Washington Post
Okay.
that looked at how in India transgendered people are treated more favorably than gay people. And it's because of the religious history of India.
Right.
And that fascinated me. You talk about the Hijra, how do you say it? Hijra.
Right.
And so I'm seeing a kind of a connection between what you just talked about from Weber and what you described in your article in the Washington Post. That religion has an effect that is totally relevant in the present.
So to just recapitulate the Weber, I mean, his thesis, 1905, Protestant Ethics, Spirit of Capitalism, is the notion of a calling. Luther's notion of calling. Rufen also means vocation, job. You're called to something. It's not the otherworldly asceticism of Catholic, monasticism, leaving the world, being detached, being ascetic, not having any material desires. Somehow with the Calvinist and Lutheran frameworks, that gets internalized into a material asceticism, the effects of which will go on to produce the tools you need to become a capitalist. Rational reinvestment, disciplining your day, saving, the paranoia of that brinkmanship, that when you die, you don't know if you're going to make it or not. But at least you internalize the psychology of maximal accrual of wealth to prove that you're worthy of something. So this will go on to make capitalism. That's that context.
That's the capitalist calling.
Capitalist calling, and then we can subject that to, obviously, in our diverse society. But getting back to the Indian context, and by the way, just for the historical record, the Indian Supreme Court this year did decriminalize the old colonial law for the first time, and now LGBTQ. At least they're decriminalized, meaning the negative right, the right to be free from persecution. Do they have positive rights like we have here in the United States and most Western countries, the legal right to marry? Not yet, but let's see what happens there. But at least that old colonial law, which was British and Victorian and Christian, is gone in that democratic non-Western context. It's a huge breakthrough. That's today. That piece is from 2014. And what I saw I thought for a second, wow, let's contrast this Western framework, the United States, and let's talk about a non-Western, South Asian Indian context that has a completely non-Judeo-Christian heritage. In their case, the majority is Hinduism, even though all the world religions are present in that society. In our separation of church and state, if we used Christian dogma today in our judicial reasoning to fight for certain secular and legal rights, like the right to marry, that's not going to go very far. Is religious freedom protected, like it was in the recent Supreme Court case about the cake maker? That's different. Protecting someone's religious freedom, in this case, a cake maker saying, look, it goes against my belief. When I know that there's a gay couple coming here for their marriage and they want me to make them a wedding cake as opposed to a birthday cake, it goes against my religious belief. I need to have that protected. Sorry, you can go somewhere else, but you can imagine from a liberal perspective, that's wanton discrimination, not to mention oppression of gay people, of LGBTQ people. So to think about the separation of church and state and the protection of religious freedom to the detriment of LGBTQ, you have that. But we have the positive right to marry, at least for now. Who knows what this conservative majority is going to do. But we don't have transgender rights. We don't have a third gender. We don't have protection in the public sphere, freedom from employment discrimination or commerce, the use of the pronouns, for that to be respected, as opposed to someone using the religious freedom to disagree with that. So it's not a legalized category of identity. What India did in 2014, while they criminalized homosexuality, which was the old British colonial law, they opened up the third gender as a third category. Not to say that group has all this liberty. They face a lot of economic oppression. They get involved in trafficking, forced, coerced sex work. So there's a lot of deprivations taking place in that community. Still a lot of stigmatization or fear, demonization of them. But they at least legalized the category. And what they drew from in the Hindu tradition, unlike our Judeo-Christian in our Western structure, or the Abrahamic faiths in general, Judeo-Christian, Islamic, they drew from the Hindu tradition, and what they opened up with two really interesting narratives. I had to learn it for myself, which was about an Indian prince who couldn't find someone to marry. So again, in this sort of heteronormative matrix about marriage and reproduction, you can't have a prince not marry and reproduce, otherwise there won't be a lineage. So in this polytheism of male and female gods, there's a lot of fluidity there in terms of the pantheon of polytheistic gods as opposed to a monotheistic system. A male god transformed into a female and married the prince. So that was one of that from an ancient epic tale. So they drew from that. And then there's
which god was that?
I wish I was an expert on in terms of the piece wasn't trying to showcase me as some kind of expert on Hinduism, but I believe the text is from the Mahabharata, and then the other epic, the Ramayana. Um, One of the gods came down and took a group of people into the forest and said, "Okay, you're going to be transformed into this new gender. You'll have special divinities or special powers, but you need to siphon yourself off, reserve yourself, protect yourself from the mass." So they thought in their heritage, at least they used these myths to justify the legal protection of this identity. But if you think about that dilemma back then, before they decriminalized homosexuality, let's say you now have the right to have a legal identification of, let's say, you were born as a male, male genitalia, cisgender, you're male assigned at birth, that's your sex identity. You want to change and become the opposite of female. If you allow for that change and you criminalize homosexuality, they're in a bind. If they go from male to female and the former male still identifies in terms of sexual attraction with another female, you would have a lesbian couple. That's banned because of the criminalization of homosexuality. If you go from male to female and force through that heteronormative matrix, now the female has to be with a male, that former male may not be comfortable because that's not the nature of their sexual attraction. So then they're forced to be ascetic. So it's either criminalized homosexuality or asceticism, because in that structure, they legalized the gender, but they didn't liberate the sexuality.
And the Hijra is this third gender.
The third gender, it has a complicated relationship to the caste system here in the US, and we still are facing this in the United States.
Well, I want to know a little bit more about Hijra. Just tell me a little bit more what you can tell us about Hijra.
It's a group of people, all the English terms that we might use to describe this group, it kind of collapses, but it's a group of people that literally, if you say transvestites, men that dress up as women, or men that identify as women, is it trans in general, is it transgender, is it a transsexual transformation, although they have the procedures for that. So it's in our vernacular, because transvestite, obviously, if 80% of transvestites, if you go with these statistics, are heterosexual, transvestite is obviously not transgender. So, these are Western binaries that start to
But what you talk about in your article is that they enabled people to register as a Hijra.
Well,
and the numbers were astronomical.
Well, it's 1.3 billion people in that country, so any percentage of any small group is going to be astronomical compared to.
But it was at least 500,000 people.
Yeah. So and by
parents were registering 6-year-olds and younger.
Sure. I mean, like I said, it's about identifying that the piece is not so much the mystery of that group. I don't want to anthropologize about that. You can get other experts to talk about. The issue is this conundrum I'm speaking of, because when you have a non-Judeo-Christian framework, multiplying genders.
That's what was fascinating about the article, that what you talked about is how the court system used the religious teachings, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana teachings,
exactly.
make their decision.
That's right. Well, I mean, a lot of us are concerned, not to shift it back here, but you can say, okay, separation of church and state here, but now with this conservative majority, people are wondering about Roe v. Wade. Now with Kavanaugh, forming a solid five majority, depending on what Roberts does, if he swings like Kennedy used to, you can say that, okay, the dissent in Roe v. Wade was when it speaks about history and tradition and precedent and constitutional literalism, that the founding figures, who would have been either deist or Christian, couldn't have possibly imagined legalizing abortion. Then this right to abortion is a legal fiction. And so that conservative view is that, although it's not relying strictly on Christianity to ban it, like an evangelical group might do or Catholics may do, there's some kind of implicit notion that if you go back in time and look at the literalism of the Constitution of who framed it and whatever values they had, but if we go with that, there wouldn't have been, the collapse of slavery.
Right. We've got 1 minute left. Anything you want to wrap up with in 1 minute?
Well, I think, my encouragement for all of us, whether we're academics or educators, at all levels of society, to activists, to people that care about our society getting through these very difficult times. A lot of people have faced a succession of traumas. You know, we talk about the 2000 election. That seems like a long time ago, the 9/11. And then the prospect and the promise as the post-racial paradigm about racism. Oh, the promise of Obama, but then you saw the critiques too on both the leftist and right conservative about his administration and the wars, et cetera, and the drones, and um, you know, a lot of the criticism he faced by a lot of progressive leftist people. So we're living in some very complex and interesting times. But the 2 points I want to leave people with, if we think about liberty, equality, justice, and rights, if we have the multiculturalism and the diversity of ideas and thoughts, so it's either the blending and the syncretism of ideas or the separation of traditions who want to then fight for their own values, which could be at odds with other groups and their values, you know, we're facing this complexity. But as philosophically thinking, not so much in terms of the policy or the law, do we have the intellectual ability, I'll bracket this term evolve, but you talked about natural evolution and organisms and systems. Can the human mind, in terms of our interactions and our policies and our laws and just the basic contract that we sign in the social, do we have the ability also to evolve our minds?
I hope so. And we got to wrap.
With our identities in our bodies.
We've got to wrap. And this has been the Rob Call Show. My guest for this show has been Rajesh Sampath. He's the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Justice, Rights, and Social Change at Brandeis University. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rob.